But on the other hand, in terms of security issues, not just the threats from North Korea, but also uncertainty of East China Sea's maritime jurisdiction, and also the Diaoyu Tai. Japan called it the Senkaku, the ownership or the sovereignty, and some of the sea land communication, and also situation in Taiwan. Okay, I have to say that Abe-san's comments of Taiwan's contingency is Japan's contingency, or Taiwan's crisis is Japan's crisis.
So maybe Kishida will change diplomacy to the South Korea or change the diplomacy to the mainland China, but he cannot change the defense security. So he cannot change the relation between the Taiwan and Japan.
Hello and welcome to TaiwanPlus I'm Yin Khvat. Following the fatal shooting of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, we're taking a look at a post-Abe world, not just for Japan, but also for Taiwan and the region. Today, I'm joined by Philip Yang of National Taiwan University, Professor of International Relations, Department of Political Science, and founder of Taiwan Security Research Center, formerly National Security Council Vice Chair under Ma Ying-jeou's Kuomintang administration. Also, Dr. Tsai Hsi-hsun of Tamkang University, Director of Graduate Institute of Japanese Political and Economic Studies. Yes. Later in the show, our political editor, Rath Wang, will also be talking to Abe biographer tobiasharris and Hudson Deputy Director Japan Chair rileywalters, both in the US. And after that, with Jane's Defense Weekly's senior editor in Japan, Kosuketakahashi. Let's go first to some recent developments and what they might mean. Philip Yang. A group of Japanese parliamentarians will visit Taiwan before the end of the month, and this visit was arranged after Abe's death. Also, our Vice President Lai Ching-te went to Japan for Abe's funeral, and to make that happen, fumiokishida issued a special emergency visa to Lai. Do these events offer clues as to the future of Taiwan-Japan relations?
First of all, that we feel very sorry about the sudden death of Abe-san. And indeed, he's a good friend of Taiwan, okay? And not just to the current ruling party, DPP party, but also in the past relations with the KMT. And he's actually very much a support to Taiwan-Japan relations, and during his 2 tenures of a prime minister. So I think that after his death, that our vice president's visit to Japan, indeed, I think that's a sign of showing that Abe-san and his family and his friends has close relationship with Taiwan and with Taiwanese government, with Taiwanese people, so that by accepting Lai's visit to Japan and issuing a visa in a matter of probably just an hours.
Because it was despite protests from China.
But this indeed showed this, the current Kishida government has to pay great attention to Abe's relationship with Taiwan. And the upcoming visit of those cabinet members from Japan.
But so what does the visit mean?
After the death of Abe-san, I think that this visit also show not just Abe's faction or his friends, but also his old-time rivalry or competitor. Of course, you know, personally they're good friends, but they probably have belong to different factions and different political parties, like the Mayahara-san. But they share the same kind of attitude toward Japan-Taiwan relations, okay? And particularly after this sudden death of Abe-san, they're willing to come to Taiwan to show that there's a cross-border support from the Japanese political spectrums that on Abe-san's insistence on enhancing Japan-Taiwan relations. And that's a good sign. Yeah.
Dr. Tsai, the cross-party visit does show strength in the Japan-Taiwan relations. Do you agree?
Yes, of course, I agree with the Professor Phillips. So we must think about one kind of Taiwan's importance, because to Taiwan or to Japan, Taiwan is so important. And they came to Taiwan not just for free lunch, because they know if you just choose Taiwan, if you just pro to Taiwan, you can get some kind of support from Japanese people.
There are reports, Philip Yang, that Kishida could remove Abe's brother, who is currently defense minister, and also Abe faithful and Abe protege Sanai Takaichi. What sort of impact would changes like that have on Japan-U.S. Taiwan ties?
I think about Kishida's problem, it's that he's in really bad health. Okay, so it's not necessary that to tend to remove he from the defense minister's positions, because I've been talking about that for weeks before Abe's sudden death, okay, because of his health issue. So that's probably will be a continuation of what being, thinking of replacing him for another person, and to respect his personal, position. But on the other hand, Kishida's government indeed actually cannot be viewed as a continuation of Abe government. Okay, after all, there is another prime minister in the middle, in between. So, but Kishida's lack of strong support of Abe faction or before Abe's death from Abe-san, that would be very difficult for him and his government to promote policies from economic to foreign policies. So there's kind of a political alignment with the Abe-san and Abe factions would be wise for him, and in particularly that to incorporate certain important figure from Abe-ha. And that's a very common practice for the Japanese LDP politics, okay? And now he's now, after the election and also after the sudden death of Abe-san, I think he's looking for a more of his own government. So there is a very natural change of certain members of his cabinet from the past. I don't think that would be a rejection of Abe's legacy or Abe faction's influence.
Okay. And Dr. Tsai, yes. Coming back to the question, how might these changes impact this sort of trilateral Japan-U.S. Taiwan ties?
I prefer to separate the national security to the military security and economic security, and also about the diplomacy. So it should be different. No matter which person becomes the prime minister, their military security will not be changed. So even the Kishida want to change, no, it's almost impossible. But Kishida maybe change the diplomacy. Diplomacy is quite easy to change, because today I'm your good friend, tomorrow I'm your enemy, and next day I'm maybe your good friend again. But the economy is the reality. I can earn some money or something from your country or none. But how about military, or we can say that's defense security? So maybe Kishida will change diplomacy to the South Korea or change the diplomacy to the mainland China, but he cannot change the defense security. So he cannot change the relation between the Taiwan and Japan. So some people will just argue that will Japan just help Taiwan on the military or the self-defense force, because in Japan they say the self-defense force. But self-defense force, they will not help Taiwan freely. They will help Taiwan or cooperate with Taiwan for something based on the national interest.
Okay. Now let's take a broader look. Will Japan continue Abe's broadly anti-China and pro-US legacy? Our political editor finds out from biographer Tobiasharris, author of The Iconoclast and lead of the Asian National Security and International Policy team at the liberal-leaning Center for American Progress. And after that, we hear from Hudson Deputy Director Japan Chair Rileywalters, who spoke with Abe not long before he passed away. Let's take a look.
What do you believe Shinzo Abe will be remembered for?
I think if you look at the tributes that have come in from world leaders in the aftermath of his death, and of course, President Biden's rare and unusual decision to order flags lowered at half-mast to honor the late Prime Minister. Clearly, the work he did to raise Japan's international profile really to position Japan to exercise leadership regionally and globally in ways that it hadn't before, clearly, I think will set his time as prime minister apart from much of what came before.
But he's also a figure of controversy, especially when it comes to domestic policy and press freedoms, including how his three arrows failed to revive an economy that continues to underperform. What would you say of Abe's policy as the longest serving Japanese prime minister?
Well, there are a few ways to think about Abe. I mean, so he had a 30-year career in Japanese politics starting in the early 1990s. And when you look at the arc of his whole career and what he wanted to do in politics, in some ways his career was actually quite a success. That he entered politics, he wanted to undo or what he later called leaving behind the post-war regime, starting with the Constitution and a number of other institutions that he felt restricted Japan's ability to be a full-fledged great power in the world, to have a strong state, a top-down centralized state that would be capable of conducting national security policy and foreign policy in a manner befitting a great power. And when you look overall, compare Japan, when he entered politics to the time, to what it looks like at the time of his death, clearly that project was a success. That when you look more specifically at what he had hoped to achieve as prime minister when he came back in 2012, and he talked about, Japan is back, and he was going to, revive the country's economic fortunes and restore Japan's prosperity as a foundation of its national power. Clearly, many of the long-term challenges that he had hoped to overcome remain. Not least its demographic outlook. I mean, and you look at, by the time he left office, after a number of different policies aimed at slowing the decline of Japan's population and reversing the decline of its workforce, you had record-breaking low number of children born in his last years as prime minister. I mean, very clearly, some of these long-term challenges, these long-term threats to Japan's prosperity remain. But I think, has shown the way for Japan, maybe in some ways, to continue to punch above its weight, even as its relative power declines.
Will Japan's overall stance of being pro-Taiwan and a bit anti or China containment shift?
I think things are likely to continue in that direction for some time to come. And in some ways, Abe, of course, was also responsible for a bit of a softening in tensions with China after 2016, as tried to find a more stable economic footing. And what I think we've seen, certainly over the last several years, certainly since COVID arrived, what really is a change in the Chinese leadership's approach to the world. And I think correspondingly in Japan, China hawks, people who want a more confrontational approach to China, I think have a much greater hearing and a much, I think in general, their views are treated much more sympathetically. And those who might have advocated for let's say more China realist, let's not say China dove even, but just wanting to keep relations on a stable footing with China, taking steps to preserve the commercial relationship, trying to compartmentalize economic cooperation and security competition. Those voices, I think, have a much harder time being heard in the current policy environment. And again, given China's own behavior towards its neighbors in recent years and towards places like Hong Kong and its activities around Taiwan, there really has been, I think, a shift in the balance of power between, the China hawks and China realists. So that is likely to endure. I mean, until we really see a shift on the part of the Chinese leadership. I mean, I think the approach in Japan is going to be raising the alarm, expressing concern about China's activities and looking to the United States and other countries to really coordinate on how to counter China's activities, both militarily but also economically as well. And so that approach, I think, is likely to continue for some years to come.
Riley, as the chair of the conservative-leaning Hudson Institute, you've spoken extensively on Abe's impact on geopolitics here. What do you believe was his worldview? Was he successful in finding the right strategy for 21st century Asia?
Well, Abe was certainly a bold reformer, and I think he was very successful in achieving much of what he desired, what he foresaw as policies that would strengthen not just Japan, but the defense of the Indo-Pacific, building the relationships not just with Japan and the United States, but Japan and Taiwan. He was really instrumental in forming many of the policies that we see today, many of the international forums like the quadrilateral strategic dialogue that Japan has with Australia, United States, and India. His free and open Indo-Pacific, this is a term that he sort of coined to materialize Japan's policy for approaching the Indo-Pacific, has actually been adopted by the Biden administration. It's a founding principle of actually much of the United States's approach to the region. And domestically speaking, he managed to create a national security council for Japan. He began steps to implement bold defense reforms for Japan's own self-defense. And of course, he was very vocal on building not just the defense of Japan for Japan's sake, but he was worried about the defense of Taiwan as well. And so we saw much more of this, I think, in sort of the last couple of years, because whether it was for a growingly belligerent China, or whether it was from the sense that more of the Japanese population were increasingly worried about a growing China, or actually more favorable toward Taiwan. Much of Abe and his political party, the Liberal Democratic Party, began to talk about the security of Japan, the security of Taiwan. And actually, a lot of that conversation carried over, not just in bilateral dialogues that Japan had with the European Union, with Australia, with the United States, but actually made its way up to the G7 summit, where these countries all agreed that the importance of security in the Taiwan Strait is a big problem and something to be considered. I spoke with Abe actually not too long ago, and I asked him, how does he feel about the new administration, the Kishida administration in Japan, and he actually, he felt confident in Kishida's more what he called realistic approach to foreign policy, and so he was confident that Kishida would make the right decisions on sensitive issues like the Japanese-Taiwan relationship. And while he might not have been the prime minister anymore, he certainly had a large voice within his political party still. And so he was still able to guide certain policies and influence certain policies, like investing more in the defense of Japan or engaging more with Taiwan. His party actually came out with this a strategy document last year on the ways that Japan can increase its relationship with Taiwan, whether it's defense, whether it's cultural, whether it's trade. Accepting Taiwan into the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So it was pretty comprehensive, and so he has certainly left the world, I think, with a strong legacy, and to a commitment not just to this strengthening of Japan, of the Indo-Pacific, but also actually more integration with the world. Japan passed not just the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it passed trade agreements with the United States. There was a trade agreement with the European Union. So it was both a dual strengthening of Japan, but also there was a bit of globalization in there as well.
Dr. Tsai, one of the fascinating aspects about Abe, as you heard there from tobiasharris, was that he was responsible for a softening of the tensions with China post-2016, and yet he was also a China hawk, advocating for a tougher stance against China. How do we reconcile this about Abe? And was his ability to achieve this actually a defining characteristic of his statesmanship?
We must understand one concept for the Abe. Abe always keeps saying, bring back the strong Japan. What is the strong Japan? Strong Japan because he's thinking about before World War I. Before World War I, Japan is so strong, but after World War II, World War II, Japan became the number 2 for the economic power. But how about now? Japan becomes so weak, so we might think he want to bring back the strong Japan. And he also say we must leave the post-war for the diplomacy or the politics. So Abe is, we might use the grand strategy to describe the Abe, because at the beginning he was so nice to the mainland China on the diplomacy. I keep thinking we must use the military security, economic security, and diplomacy. So he was so nice to the mainland China on the diplomacy, not on the military. Why? Because we must understand this data. This data is for the self-defense force, the white paper. We can understand this data. China's the budget for the defense or for the military increased so fast. But how about Japan? Japan's self-defense force, the budget is so low. He understands mainland China is a neighbor. You cannot move Japan to another place, for example, to the United States, to the Europe. So I think at the beginning he must keep his position, because as a politician, you must become the politician. You must win the election. Otherwise, you cannot say anything. So at the beginning, he was so nice to the mainland China. But at the end of his term for the prime minister, he just said, I already have created and recorded for the Japanese number 1 as the prime minister. So he just showed his ambition. So his ambition just keep in mind, just repeat again. He want to bring back the strong Japan. But in Taiwan or in another country, we always confuse, what is the strong? He says strong, not great. Because if you say the great, maybe we will think about the militarism. So he understands we must keep saying strong, not the great. So as my viewpoint, he's a great strategist. He's, a great politician. That's why he has so much support.
Philip Yang, do you agree with that? The separation of the economy, diplomacy, and military?
Military, yes.
Yeah.
Well, Abe-san is indeed a naturalist politician, but he is also a realist. Okay, a realist when he was a prime minister, and for 2 terms, and also even when he retired from the prime minister, that he remained as a realist. The realists have to look at the changes of the overall environment, and not just economic, but also security, and what are the major, external threats for Japan, and support for Japan. I think that he strongly sensed that there's the change of a Sino-U.S. relationship. Okay. When you talk about Japanese foreign policy and military and security issues, have a look at not just the U.S.-Japan relationship and also the security alliance, but also the overall U.S. and China relationship. Okay. During his first term, actually, he tried very hard to improve the relationship with Beijing, and in the second term as well.
How do you think Xi Jinping viewed Abe-san?
I think Xi Jinping viewed Abe-san as a figure that tried to preserve the Japanese traditional values and interests, economic and security interests. And I think that judging from the address, the remark that he issued after his death, Abe-san's death, I think that he pretty much recognized his efforts, okay, both as a politician of the Japanese LDP and as a prime minister of improving, Japan-China relationship. Okay, but on the other hand, in terms of security issues, not just the threats from North Korea, but also uncertainty of East China Sea's maritime jurisdiction, and also the Diaoyu-Tai. Japan called it the Senkaku, the ownership or the sovereignty, and some of the sea land communication, and also situation in Taiwan. Okay, I have to say that Abe-san's comments of Taiwan's contingency is Japan's contingency, or Taiwan's crisis is Japan's crisis. It's a very simple logic for common Japanese to understand, to grasp the very complicated security and military situation in East Asia.
Rileywalters, he talks about an LDP strategy document last year about deepening Japan-Taiwan ties, and he actually credits Abe with the strategy. There is a Taiwan delegation that's going over to Japan next month, and during that time they will be proposing a Japanese version of the U.S. Taiwan Travel Act. That act is about expanding the exchanges between high-level officials. To people watching who may not understand the significance of something like that, could you explain to them why this would actually be significant?
If Japan want to do something or do some kind of policy to Taiwan, they will listen to the China on their viewpoint. So they cannot send any the high-level officer came to Taiwan, but we will criticize them. Even me, I will criticize them. You are so nice to Taiwan. You say so much to Taiwan, but you cannot send high-level officers to Taiwan. But how about the United States? United States, they send us high-level officers came to Taiwan. So you are independent. You have your sovereignty. You have your country. Why you cannot just send something to Taiwan? So United States has this kind of law. So Japan want to just follow the United States. So to the Japan, it's easy to follow the United States step because they will use the United States to persuade the Japanese people. Okay, listen and watch. United States do this way, so we can just follow this way.
And is this why there's such a big controversy over a possible visit from Nancy Pelosi, who will be the only sitting House Speaker, I think, for decades to come to Taiwan? So that is why, because of China, that it's a
yes,
it's a big
just
deal.
I say, so this kind of law will be good for them to send some people to Taiwan.
Well, if I may add a little bit, the complexity between Taiwan, Japan, and China, that we don't have a diplomatic relations ever since 1972. It's good for Japanese high officials and also Taiwanese officials visit each other, but it will create tremendous pressures on Japanese government. And of course, you can see that, I'm not saying that this is not the right thing to do, but it certainly create some pressure and problem for our friends in Japan.
So it would be provocative.
It would be provocative, and it would be unpredictable in terms of Japan-China relations. Even in terms of cross-strait relations, we create some unpredictable incidents, if that's even the possibility for that. So I'm not saying that we're afraid of this kind of changes, but it would have to take the Japanese way of doing things, okay? It's not like the U.S. that, because U.S. different from Japan, U.S. is number one, and U.S. Strongly supported Taiwan with the, Taiwan Relations Act, and but Japan, after all, it's a very complicated relationship with Beijing. So I try not to push this issue that much, because not from our side, but from for the sake of our friends in Japan. And what is more important is that how to enhance U.S.-Taiwan, Japan-Taiwan relationship is not just to single out those very well-known, outspoken or media attention cases of visits or things like that, but how to go deeper to the people, to the economy, to the technology cooperation, and then based on that for what we call the building block for the two economy to sign an FTA-like agreement. That will further. That would
So
be a
if
strong
you were in
enhancement
government,
of a.
if the Kuomintang was in government, you're saying that you wouldn't focus so much on
I
this
myself
sort of thing.
actually involved in the signing of the Japan-Taiwan fishery agreement, which actually in the past 17 years, 18 rounds of negotiations with no result, and we actually make it work. And that's, I have to say, that's the support of Abe-san. So Abe-san actually very much support U.S. Japan-Taiwan relationship, but what we need is not just this kind of spoken visits, cases like that, but also what is the concrete enhancement of bilateral relationship.
This brings me to my next question, which is that Kishida has been described, Dr. Tsai, as a dove. Obviously, this is in contrast to Abe's as a China hawk, and therefore supportive of Taiwan. Rileywalters touched on a private conversation that he had with Abe not long before Abe passed away, where Abe was saying he had faith in Kishida that he would do the right thing on Taiwan. So I guess the question that everyone in Taiwan wants to know is, how will Kishida, as Japan's Prime Minister, reconcile his dovishness with his policy on Taiwan and maybe Abe's legacy? How does all of this can be reconciled?
Oh, I must say one worry, because you just mentioned the Taiwan crisis is a Japan's crisis. Actually, Abe, he just said the Taiwan crisis is Japan's crisis, also Japan-U.S. alliance crisis. Why he also mentioned about the United States? Because Japan has the Constitution Article 9. They cannot send the force to the foreign country. How about Kishida? Why Kishida can become the prime minister? Because Abe. Last year for the election, Abe supported Kishida, and even Kishida become the prime minister. We can show you another one. It's called the manifest. This one is the manifest for the election. Each election they will have manifest. So I will show you another key one. Is this one on the manifest in here? Let's just say Taiwan. So you are prime minister. You say, well, we want to cooperate with the Taiwan already in here. So he cannot change his policy. Just I mentioned, even you are prime minister, you must follow the rule. You must say something good to the Taiwan, based on the, just I say, the defense or the military security. So I cannot say Kishida will violate this kind of law. And I will also say another one, because in the Kishida party is the number 4. Abe party is the number 1. So number 1 and compared with number 4 must listen to the number 1. So I cannot see the possibility is so high. Kishida will violate this kind of law.
I think that Kishida has the upcoming 3 years, to maintain as a prime minister of Japan without any need to hold any elections. Okay, so this what they call the golden 3 years. For a Japanese prime minister, that's really unusual. As a matter of fact, that even though Abe-san has a longer term and tenure than that. However, Kishida's because of he's a little bit in an inferior status of a smaller factions facing a strong faction pressure from the Abe factions. But on the other hand, Abe's faction, as we discussed just now, that also has an internal problem or leadership problem. So I think on one hand, the Abe faction would take this Abe legacy as a idea, to fight for and to put pressures on Kishida government, particularly on relations with Taiwan and China and United States, and also the issue of constitutional revision. And on the other hand, Kishida's a very pragmatic, okay, and he's more of a, not with this kind of a nationalist, not so strong like Abe-san. So he's a pragmatic, and also knowing that his positions inside the LDP. But as a prime minister, you definitely want to put forward your own policies.
Okay, and so from there we will turn specifically to defense. Abe was pushing for greater defense spending from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP. So what will Abe's passing mean for Japan's role in regional security? Well, our political editor spoke with Jane's Defense Weekly senior correspondent Kosuketakahashi from Japan. Let's take a look.
Takashi-san, the weekend after Abe's death, we have seen a boost for LDP support, with a recent upper house win, which could mean that a conservative force is growing. With a greater mandate, will Kishida maintain Abe's anti-China and pro-American line, and what does this mean to the constitutional reform?
Constitutional change was long Abe Shinzo's dream, and many LDP members may want to achieve it in his memory. Abe wanted to specify self-defense forces in Article 9, but the problem is Kishida is seen as not so very enthusiastic about the constitutional reform compared to Abe. Kishida places high priority to tackle the cost of living issues and Japan's economic security problem. So we will see what kind of Kishida will take attitude from now on.
Thank you, Takahashi-san.
Yeah.
Given that Kishida is part of the dovish faction of the LDP, as opposed to Abe's hawkish wing, how do you see the Japan Self-Defense Forces regional role going forward under Kishida?
Public interest in national security and constitutional change is gradually rising amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in addition to North Korea's continuing nuclear and missile development, and also, most importantly, China's assertive behavior. So Kishida will, I'm sure, try to enhance Japan's defense, especially towards the year end, where when he has to revise the national defense policy he promised.
Takahashi-san, so given that Kishida did agree to enhance that part, what does this mean to East Asian security in general?
Security environment in Japan is only getting worse. Japan is now the only country in East Asia to face three most serious military threats, which are from China, Russia, North Korea. It cannot be said that Japan defense capability alone have a sufficient defense capability to counter these three threats. So we need cooperation from the US, Australia, India, and maybe Taiwan. And then, therefore, we are now arguing the defense spending should be increased in coming 5 years. And also on Taiwan, for Japan, Taiwan's fate is not somebody else's problem. Taiwan is only 110 kilometers away from Yonaguni Island in Okinawa Prefecture. And then Taiwan is strategically very important place, located at the first island chain, which extended from Japan's Kyushu Island to Philippines, thus becoming the far front of the China and the US conflict. Japan's former defense minister Morimoto said to me, the biggest problem is the government officials from Japan, the US, and Taiwan have never discussed how they cooperate in Taiwan contingency. And this is because Taiwan is not recognized as a sovereign nation yet. So we have to discuss this promptly.
So Philip Yang, you heard there Kosuketakahashi talking about, as you mentioned, changing the constitution because, of course, after Second World War, Japan embraced the peaceful constitution. What would a change in this constitution, what would that mean for Taiwan?
Well, as a matter of fact, this constitution was actually imposed by the United States after the Second World War during the occupation of the Allied forces. But the Japanese deniers accepted, and also in the content, particularly Article 9, to characterize this constitution as a pacifist constitution. Okay, so it goes really deep in the society that pacifism is a very strong backbone of Japanese society after the war. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why they focus on economic and technology development during the Cold War. And
it's actually been hard for Abe-san to move that because of the public.
It's almost impossible in terms of the criteria of a constitutional revisions, because you need both the 2/3 of the two diodes and the upper house and the lower house, and a referendum from the people. So I personally, I'm not that, positive about this outcome, because it's a great political movement, and this movement would take probably more than a year. And looking at the current Japanese situation, that the economy and the inflation, okay, and so I don't think that this is Kishida's government will, put 100% of the energy try to push for this.
Dr. Tsai, so what would that constitutional change, what would that mean for Taiwan?
So how about Taiwan? We always ask Japan if we have some kind of issue or the conflict with mainland China, Japan send the self-defense force came to Taiwan. They didn't revise constitution yet, but on the manifest, they already say in here, in the 5 years, they will choose the NATO GDP 2% for the military budget, already saying here. And then they also say the counterattack ability. Counterattack ability to which country? Mainland China, North Korea, Russia. But to Taiwan, North Korea is not our business. Russia is not our business. So mainland China, they think about the counterattack ability. So if they change this kind of, just constitution or the Article 9 is easy for them. But even they didn't change this one. If they add the self-defense force to the 2%, result, I will show you this kind of result. Based on the Sweden SIPRI, the new data for this year, 2022 should be the main. And now Japan's budget in the whole world should be the number 9. If they move to the 2 GDP%, will be the number 3.
You heard also in the interview with Takahashi that Japan's former Defense Minister Satoshi Morimoto told him that the biggest problem is that Japan, the US, and Taiwan have never actually discussed before how they would cooperate with an attack on Taiwan. How critical a problem, Dr. Tsai, do you think this is for Taiwan, and how should Taiwan push this pressing issue to ensure that there is an allied response in place should this happen?
Yes, because we didn't have a diplomatic tie with Japan, so it's quite difficult for us. Official talking. We cannot talk with them. They don't want to talk with us. We basically only use their track 2. For example, like me, I'm a scholar, so I can talk with them. So even I can talk with them, but it's not so powerful. So we need to talk. But how to talk?
So is this what the Japanese version of the Taiwan Travel Act?
Oh, yes.
Would this allow this sort of discussion?
We need to dialogue. Otherwise, you only say we will. The Taiwan crisis, the Japanese crisis is also the Japan-U.S crisis. But if we have a crisis, what can we do? We didn't talk. We didn't
coordinate.
Yes, I think it's quite critical.
Philip Yang, can I ask you, obviously this is a critical problem. So how does Taiwan push this issue? Is it creating this Taiwan Travel Act with Japan? Is there anything else that we should be doing?
Well, there's so many different kinds of communication channels between Taiwan and Japan, from second track to 1/2, and from time to time also the first track communications channels exist. Economic and trade issues and technology cooperations, and it just in terms of political and military issues that probably go a little bit low profile, but whether there's a need that you have to move on the service, and that would attract attentions, unnecessary attentions.
You mean from China?
From China, and also from Japan as well. Okay, because some factions and the political parties disagree of putting Taiwan on the spotlight that will attract tensions across the Taiwan Strait. That's not the Japanese ways of doing things. That because on one hand, because after all, you cannot create diplomatic ties with Taiwan, and you cannot just sign military, agreement with Taiwan. So how to help Taiwan to enhance our own, self-defense capability and to deter any military crisis from happening across the Taiwan Strait, because that's also a factor.
Do we need military exercises?
I think it's very difficult because we don't have a military relationship or alliance with Japan. Okay, and neither can we have a military exercise with the United States. Okay, but we can take part in some multilateral exercise, for instance, like the RIMPAC, okay, in the past, but only as observers. Okay, because if that
not even an observer this year.
Not even an observer this year. The U.S. Congress actually demanded that it should to count Taiwan in, but that's for the sake of how to maintain. At the end of the day, it's the cross-strait peaceful situation. Okay, and you're not looking at the situation that giving your own fate to, to be decided by the other side. Okay, but on the other hand, how to enhance your dialogue and working relationship with your friends, particularly from Tokyo. I think that will be vital.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to our guests, Philip Yang and Tsai Hsi-hsun. For more Taiwan Plus Point shows, please download the app. Stay safe and see you next time.